Hello, checking in with my audiobook because I had to be listening to some audiobook. I have to be. I've listened to the first three chapters of Hill of Dreams by Arthur Machen, a Welsh novelist. This is a semi-autobiographical novel, to all accounts. It was written between like 1895 and 1897 and then published in 1907. Um, talks Tells the story of Lucian Taylor, uh, young eccentric young man who's kind of very eccentric, like his father, apparently a very poor clergyman, also eccentric, very bookish. He's kind of singled out in school because he actually is really into learning Greek and Latin and just all the learning. And he's surrounded by kind of young barbarians, as he semi-affectionately calls them, of very kind of anti-intellectual types that are really not into that sort of stuff. He comes home. He's walking along in the countryside. He sees a young woman. Uh, she's like he's 18. She's like 15. It's like, sees her, slightly smitten. She smiles at him and nods. He goes off into the countryside and comes upon a Roman fort. And with Arthur Machen, he's really obsessed with like the old and the ancient and the pagan. This is very kind of the aesthetic movement, maybe also kind of gothic. There's just tons of atmosphere and all this uh, in his prose and stuff and such like that. It's just very kind of, you know um, very kind of drenched in kind of the mystery and mysticism, and kind of, yeah, just this kind of overwhelming, kind of slightly malevolent nature of things, nature in general. Um, he gets out of school. He becomes, I guess this is where we get to the semi autobiographical. He's writing. He writes a novel. He like labors over it and thinks about it, and he sends it away. And you get the kind of usual thing with writers of like, oh, it's there forever and ever. He finally kind of writes a note to them to say, like, you know did it arrive? And says, oh yeah, the readers got it, but it has a head cold, but it will be back to you in a week. And of course it's not back to him in a week, but when it does get it back, it's rejected. And he's like, oh, I guess that's the thing. And we have kind of a slightly humorous, slightly sarcastic, caustic thing of he takes in like a selection of books that this very publisher um, published, and they're really, it's like a lot of junk. It's a lot of crap. Sporting novels, very kind of, it's very light. Let's just say it's very light stuff. It's very anti-intellectual stuff, not really particularly well put together. Just blunt kind of, stuff that sells and that probably middle brow or lower middle brow people actually want to read, not maybe his literary fruits, which, you know, he kind of goes back to, and he looks at it and is like, oh, even from like kind of a standing back from he hasn't looked at it in a while. It's like, now it's like I'm reading a different man's work. And it's like, oh, it's kind of okay. And his father doesn't even want to read his manuscript at all. But a while later, he gets another book from the publisher, and he starts reading it, and his work is in there. It's like, oh, it's not all his work, but like, oh, there's a good 90 pages of his stuff kind of interwoven in this work. And he kind of takes it to his father, who's like, now is like really impressed, like, oh my God, someone stole your work and they put it in a book, and why, my God, it must be good then. And he actually reads it and he tells like, wow, this is good. Well, you're going to have to go after him then, go after him. And he's like, it's hardly worth the while. I've kind of gone on to another book. It's this kind of eccentric thing to him. And while his father's eccentric, she's like, no, you should really go after him. But that never does. And he goes on to work on another book. Um, but he's also just really taken up by passion. This is like years are going by here, and he's still really into the passion of this young woman. And he comes upon her, and they have a bit of a scene of kind of like requited love, and he just lays his head on her breast and cries, and it's just like sobbing, and she kind of comforts him. um and he's really is the odd duck in this community of, they just kind of look at him and just like, you are bizarre. All these other people are very kind of conventional, kind of country folk, kind of rustic, not really particularly that many thoughts in their head other than the very kind of practical thoughts of the day. And he's just so much otherwise. Um, he goes into the you see, I've skipped over the whole thing of like in that Roman fort. He lies down, and I think he like gets undressed, and he sleeps, and he's tormented by kind of visions of a fawn, and his body is kind of overwhelmed, and there's like a sexual component to it, and you wonder, it's like, he has these unspeakable desires. You wonder if it's like a slightly coded as gay, like, fawn, not as like, it's like is that like a gorgeous young male figure with hooves or something like that? It's just sort of like odd. um but then he has other things of like being in the woods and lying down and being naked and getting flushed and kind of overwhelmed with desire in a kind of very kind of ethereal, mystical sort of way. Um, and later on in these chapters, he's gotten kind of branches and taken them into his room, and now kind of at nights when he's kind of like tormented by feelings, he lays down the branches and he lies on them, and he talks about the exquisite pain of the thorns digging into his skin, giving him some sort of release. Is just like okie dokie. um and so there's like just, the incredibly sensual nature, but also kind of sadomasochistic kind of um desires. And this is with like, people saying like, well, you should be writing more in kind of like, Dickens or Trollope, which, I'm sure by 1895 or 1997 are incredibly, that are like a couple of generations ago now, a generation ago of your parents' work. It would just be like so conventional at that point, even though I love my Trollope. Because now he's passed well beyond generations, and it's just old work, as is Mackin. Um, but he's getting kind of like iller and iller, and he's like looking more and more hollow-eyed. And the local ladies who are all about temperance, except that they all get the doctors to like prescribe them booze to drink, because of how their vapors or whatever. But they're still getting alcohol, like all everything. But they see him kind of staggering down the road and think, oh, he must be drinking, and start spreading, things if he's a drunkard. And isn't it good that his mother, Miss Taylor, passed on and doesn't have to see what her son's gotten up to, which, um, a penniless writer. It's like, it's not that great. Um, and But he talks to the doctor about this, who actually kind of quite likes him, and they kind of laugh over the whole kind of hypocrisy of these ladies. And he seems to have kind of he seems to be, at least at this point, be kind of like, I don't care about these people and their little hypocrisies, and their kind of anti-intellectualism used to really irk him, but he's let it go now. But we have a scene of him at the end of these chapters, which is like, it really Macken's just digging the thing in, where he comes upon a group of young boys, and they're torturing and kicking a little puppy, who is like trying to like get one of them to love him. Um, and it's just like, it's really disgusting. They end up hanging the little dog, killing it. Lucian, I guess, witnesses this and does nothing, which makes me fucking hate him. And a little girl comes by saying, Jack, Jack. And it's like it's her little dog that's escaped. And he's like, oh, no point in looking for him, little girls. Some boys got him and hanged him. He's dead. It's just like, fuck you. And then he kind of wanders off because he's got other more important thoughts. Although Mackin kind of circles her back around to that because he finds a rood, which I think is like an old kind of Catholic cross in this Protestant Wales, which has like a little sermon on it about how, we need to protect the animals that are underneath us, even though, they don't have souls and they're going to go to hell. But St. Jerome, I think it's St. Jerome, and caring for the animals and stuff like that, which is like an odd little thing in there. And he thinks about this rood as he's walking around through the things, and it's just so that was a brutal way to finish these three things, because it's like, you self-involved asshole who couldn't save a little dog. And I know that that's probably not the most important thing in the chapter, but there's also just that thing of, the beastliness of the young, which actually kind of ties in with a lot of the obviously deep, dark or animalistic emotions that he's having, the lusts he's having for the young woman, the desires he's having. It's interesting that they talk about Robert Louis Stevenson being kind of a contemporary who kind of shares a lot of themes with him, because just sort of like the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing of just like, he's this egghead intellectual, but he also is like, torturing, getting off on pain, has a lots of, lusts and desires, a lot of what I could take as kind of almost pre-Freudian kind of like id moments in this novel. And the little boys, aren't little angels who would like just love little dogs. It's like, no, they're little fuckers who would torture and kill an animal just for the pleasure of it. So it's there for a reason, and I guess Lucian is so much a part of that he isn't somebody who's going to actually be there to protect that little dog. He's pretty much holding on the edge of his own humanity that way, I suppose. And I guess we'll see how it goes from there. But that is the Hill of Dreams, the hill being the Roman fort, which is, I guess, the ancient pagan, non-Christian, non-charitable, that rood, being kind of battered and tossed aside and forgotten in this landscape is probably also emblematic. And so dark stuff, even if it is just it's not like I've read other Mackin, The Great God Pan, which was much more horror genre, while this is, it's got mystical elements, but you can see that this is actually maybe a semi-autobiographical, apparently, recounting of Mackin's life. So yeah, or a dark path that potentially Mackin could have gone down is the other kind of interpretation of this. So it's like it might be a what if kind of story about Mackin. So we'll leave it there for tonight. Talk to you later.